Hey, it's Matt, your average gamer, and this is day 28 of a build video every day until they announce DLC. And for the weekend, we're going to celebrate with a couple lists here. To start, we're going to do the 5 best arcane builds in Elden Ring, starting with Moghwyn's Sacred Spear. These aren't in any particular order. All of these shred completely. They're all fantastic to use. They all do a ton of bleed, ton of damage in general, and Moghwyn's Sacred Spear is no exception. It's super powerful. This weapon art is fantastic, doing immense fire damage while proccing bleed at a fairly good rate as well. The weapon art Blood Boon Ritual does immense damage, and even though you're a standing target, as you can see here with Malachite, who's quite fast, it makes up for it in the ridiculous levels of damage it does. This is on max scaling, by the way, and it absolutely shreds him for a lot of damage, as it does with most of the bosses in Elden Ring. Moghwyn's Sacred Spear can carry you through the majority of the game. This is no doubt one of my favorite arcane weapons in the game, and the weapon art is also a ton of fun to use in the fact that just basically being able to shred targets for ridiculous levels of damage, and if you're able to get that third one up, because it basically has 3 stages, that last stage of the weapon art does immense damage between the fire and then usually always getting a bleed proc. If you're able to use it entirely through, the damage is insane. If you haven't tried Moghwyn's Sacred Spear, there is no better time to try this weapon out. With DLC inevitably coming, we know at some point it's going to happen. This is a fantastic weapon to get into. It's awesome. Let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have Moghwyn's Sacred Spear plus 10. We have the Dragon Communion Seal, because why not? It scales with Arcane. We have the White Mask on, Shard of Alexander, Ritual Swords Talisman, Lord of Blood's Exaltation. We have the Fire Scorpion Charm, and you can use the Fire tier, and then the Faith tier to give you 10 more levels, so you can do some buffs as well. That, by the way, might make my levels add up to 160, so if you're getting confused, it's just using that Faith tier to give you the extra 10 levels. Now for stats, you want to heavily invest in Arcane. Strength is more for the physical damage part. The weapon art, from my experience, scales best with Arcane, so you want to be able to get that to 60. Have a fairly decent amount of vigor as well. A little bit of mine too, because it can be a little bit costly as far as the weapon art goes. It's definitely something that can chew through a little bit of FP, but overall I ended up really liking the stats for this one. This is a fantastic setup to do a lot of damage. And next up is the Rivers of Blood. Now, I know what you may be thinking. For the people that were there at launch like myself, the Rivers of Blood used to be the best weapon in the game, or one of the top 3, absolutely no question about it. The weapon art actually procced bleed 2 or 3 times on it. It was insane, but it was a little bit too overpowered. It was a little ridiculous in PvE, and it did make the game very easy. And although there's still a lot of builds that do that, the Rivers of Blood now will proc about once on the weapon art through the entire thing. However, even with that said, since the base damage was raised a little bit after the nerf, it's still a fantastic weapon to use with a very good weapon art, and it's still very powerful, and I actually found the game to still be quite easy with it. The Rivers of Blood is still quite good. It can shred a lot of the bosses in the game, and since it does both fire damage and bleed, and the fact that the weapon art is so simple and easy to use, it definitely falls into the category of still being one of the best arcane weapons in the game, and it's just a fantastic weapon in general. Again, the weapon art is definitely something that's very easy to use. The range on it is still decent, even though I think they may have patched that a little bit as well. Overall, though, it's still a fantastic arcane weapon that can absolutely shred, even on the max scaling of the game. Taking on some field bosses here and stuff, they go down very quickly. And it can still shred by all means. It's still something that's a little bit overpowered, just not incredibly overpowered. Still very easy to use, still very powerful. And since a lot of the bosses in the game are neutral to fire and take good damage from bleed, you're going to be able to proc fairly easily on most of them, while also getting in that fire damage. And the Rivers of Blood makes for a very well-rounded arcane build that's very powerful. Now let's get into equipment. Now for equipment, we have the Rivers of Blood plus 10. We have the Dragon Communion Seal, because again it scales with Arcane. We have the White Mask. We have the Shard of Alexander, Millicent's Prosthesis, Lord of Blood's Exaltation. We have the Rotten Wing Sword Insignia. Then we're going to use that Consecutive Attack, Successive Attack tier, and the Authority tier, and the Faith tier for buffs. And for stats, you want to split mainly with Dex and Arcane here. Those are going to be your 2 main stats. Dexterity is going to give you more of the physical damage part of it, and Arcane is going to give you more of the bleed damage, so you want to invest in both of those. Have a fairly decent amount of vigor and mind as well. This weapon art can definitely chew through the FP, so you want a little bit of that too. Overall, this is a really powerful 150 build for the Rivers of Blood. And next up is probably my favorite of all the bleed builds, Scavenger Curved Swords. Let's get into this. This one is absolutely ridiculous and shreds. Scavenger curved swords do massive damage. When somebody suggested to try them out for the bleed build, I decided to try it versus the twin blade and ultimately decided that it was better because the damage in between procs is insane. While it doesn't proc as fast as the twin blades do, the pure AR and damage between procs and when procking becomes more difficult as a fight continues was ridiculous. The build up on consecutive and jump attacks give the Scavenger curved swords a huge damage advantage. These are two weapons I found to be absolutely awesome, and even for bosses that are immune to bleed, if you switch them to just a cult or just in general, you're not using seppuku on them or any other Ash of War, lightning, fire, doesn't matter. They'll do ridiculous damage and absolutely shred because of the sheer amount of damage you get from the jump attacks, consecutive attack damage buildup, and the fact that the base damage is fantastic. And the occult will also scale with the innate bleed on the weapon, making them extremely overpowered. There's no doubt, if you're looking for an easy mode for Elden Ring, the Scavenger curved swords have to be nearly at the top of the list, and they don't require a ridiculous amount of buffing either. It's not something you need to go crazy with the buffing. Use seppuku on both your offhand, your main hand, use something like Golden Bow and Flame Grant Me Strength, and do ridiculous levels of damage. This was done on max scaling, by the way. I believe this was Journey 12 at the time, and I was able to literally shred the Fire Giant along with the majority of bosses in Elden Ring, even Radagon and Elden Beast. It can surprisingly shred them on Occult as well, even though they're immune to bleed. The jump attacks, the consecutive attack build up, and the sheer amount of AR and damage on these, like I said, is absolutely insane. Now let's get into equipment. Now for equipment, we have two Scavenger curved swords plus 25. We have seppuku on both. Any seal will do. We have the white mask and Raptor's black feathers on, claw talisman, rotten wing sword insignia, Millicent's prosthesis, Lord of Blood's exaltation, and then we have the consecutive attack tier and the faith tier for buffs as well. This is the only one, by the way, where I would change stats up a bit. For this one, I went with Dexterity and Arcane originally because I didn't know how I was going to do this or do the split, but eventually decided to go for Occult. And if you're going for Occult, go for minimum Dexterity and 80 Arcane to make the most out of the weapon, and then all the other stats you can pretty much fill in at that point. They're all fine as far as that goes. But yeah, I would go for minimum Dex, 80 Arcane, and you can maximize your damage because we ended up using them on Colt to absolutely shred, and it'll scale with the bleed on it as well. Next up, the Reduvia Bloodblade. If you're looking for a dagger build, look no further. The Reduvia Bloodblades are absolutely awesome. Bloodblade has a ton of bleed buildup. We're going to talk about that. It can be boosted by the shard as far as damage goes, and the weapons themselves proc bleed very quickly. These are two extremely powerful daggers. The Bloodblade themselves, if you're able to get close to a target while hitting with the dagger itself, because the contact and the Bloodblade will give you around 150 bleed buildup per one if you're like on top of a target, and around 100 if you're at a distance. So that's pretty fantastic. And for PvP and against NPC invader type enemies as well, it absolutely shreds. Yeah, the Reduvia is absolutely fantastic to use. I had a ton of fun when I ran through and did a run with them. They do taper off a little with some of the late game bosses, but overall, as far as daggers go, they honestly, it's hard to match them. They're fantastic. The Bloodblade giving you a little bit of that mid-range bleed too. Pretty cool, pretty good weapons. These definitely make the top of my list for the Bloodblade alone, and the fact that you get a little bit of mid-range bleed. Now let's get into equipment. For equipment, we have two Reduvias at plus 10. You don't really need two though, but if you want the quick build up on the L1s, use two. White Mask, Green Turtle Talisman, Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, Lord of Blood's Exaltation, Shard of Alexander to boost the Bloodblade, and then we have the consecutive attack tier and faith tier for buffs as well. For stats, very similar to the Rivers of Blood. You want to go with Dexterity and Arcane as your main two stats, and then everything else is kind of entirely up to you. The Arcane's obviously going to give you that bleed scaling and the Dexterity for the damage, and Bloodblade itself scales really well with Arcane, so these are fantastic stats to have. I tried out a couple different things and they worked out great. The Reduvia is awesome. For the final Arcane build, not a bleed build, Marais Executioner. Extremely powerful. Let's get into this one. This one's a lot of fun. Yeah, this is for arcane builds, but generally speaking, as far as damage goes, obviously bleed builds take up a lot of the meta and they do so much damage and you don't need a ton of buffs or anything. Now, Marais Executioner is one where you can do it at 150. I did it on a level 200 character here though. This absolutely shreds and is right there with the bleed builds. It's a strength arcane weapon and it's incredibly powerful. Yeah, this is absolutely a fantastic weapon to use if you want to use something that can just shred bosses. As you can tell, I added some buffs to it there, and I was able to just two-hit Radahn. I think this character was on Journey 5. It's fantastic as far as damage goes. For equipment, we have Marais Executioner plus 10. We have any seal. We're using the Black Dumpling and Mushroom Crown for some extra damage. Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, Godfrey Icon. We have Kindred of Rot's Exaltation, Shard of Alexander. Then you can use the Consecutive Attack tier and Faith tier for buffs as well. Magic tier will also boost us a little bit as well too. Now, these are my level 200 stats, but for you, if you're at 150 or you want to stay meta relevant, you can get completely comparable damage by going for 40 strength and 40 arcane. That'll soft cap the damage on the weapon, hard caps around 60 and 60. Those are your two main stats, and obviously this is very much an arcane weapon because that's a lot of the damage for the weapon itself. It's pretty much split through strength and arcane, and that damage builds up on consecutive attack bonuses, which are fantastic, adds up to a ton of damage Marais Executioner can do, shred a ton of bosses in Elden Ring. And that's it for day 28. We're going to do a couple lists this weekend. Hopefully it's really fun, gives you guys a little bit of a library to use on the channel and stuff, and hopefully celebrate the fact that it's been a year since one of the most fantastic games I've ever played came out. I love Dark Souls series. Elden Ring took it to the next level with the open world. It's a fantastic game. Hopefully we get that DLC news soon as well. I also started a Patreon as well to help support the channel, so if you want to support the channel even more, feel free to do that. I'm going to add a little bit of exclusive content on there. There's also a sheet there that I use basically as my notes on how to create builds if people want to check that out. In the meantime though, definitely be sure to sub if you love overpowered PvE builds. There's a ton of awesome builds on my channel. Can't wait to do a few more of these. Thanks for watching everybody, and I will catch you guys there.